Welcome to Study Hall, and to our segment, But Why Though?, where we explore the origins of everything.
Always a pleasure to be back in the study hall, ready to tackle another fundamental why with you.
And today's why comes directly from you, our ever-curious listener. You've been sending us some really interesting stuff lately, really making us think about the history of how societies organize themselves, particularly when it comes to gender. The big question that we're all asking is, how did we go from what looks like some pretty egalitarian beginnings to the patriarchal structures that, let's face it, still dominate in many parts of the world?
It certainly is a journey that spans millennia and touches on nearly every aspect of what it means to be human.
Yeah, and we've got a ton of sources to guide us. We're talking anthropological deep dives into early societies, the legal texts of ancient civilizations, and analyses of the shifts in religious and social thought throughout history. It's a real deep dive.
Our mission, should we choose to accept it, of course we have, is to excavate the key factors that contributed to this monumental transformation. We're hunting for those aha moments, those surprising twists in the narrative that shed light on how we got here. We want to give you a clear and engaging understanding without getting bogged down in every single detail.
All right.
Ready to start digging.
Let's journey back to the early days of human societies. What the sources suggest is a picture that really challenges our modern assumptions. It seems early hunter-gatherer societies were largely egalitarian, not naturally patriarchal. These early societies, small, mobile, utterly reliant on everyone pulling their weight, rigid gender roles just weren't practical.
Precisely. Survival in those small nomadic bands depended on intense cooperation. Resources were generally shared, and this mutual support shaped their social structures. Hierarchies based solely on gender just weren't efficient.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about holding hands and singing Kumbaya. Women played a crucial economic role. Gathering plant-based foods was often more reliable and actually provided the majority of the calories for the group, sometimes a whopping 60 to 80% of the diet, according to some studies. That's not a minor contribution, that's foundational.
Exactly. This significant economic contribution created a real mutual dependence between men and women. Neither gender's role was inherently superior when it came to the fundamental task of feeding the community. Leadership tended to be based on demonstrable skill and experience. Say, who was the best at tracking game or who knew which plants were safe to eat, not simply on whether you were male or female.
We even see some fascinating archaeological hints of this more balanced past. High-status female burials from cultures like the Grevetian, dating back tens of thousands of years, and those mysterious Venus figurines popping up across vast geographical areas. What's interesting about these Venus figurines, which often emphasize female reproductive features, is that they suggest a widespread cultural reverence for female power and the ability to give life.
What's particularly striking is that these findings challenge the long-held assumption that male dominance is some kind of natural, universal feature of human societies. These early archaeological indicators suggest a much more nuanced and in some ways balanced social landscape.
And then we have the examples of societies that practiced matrilineal descent, tracing family lineage through the mother side, and those that revered powerful female deities, like Inanna, Ishtar, and Cybele. These point to significant female influence and spiritual power.
It does indeed. And when you think about it, in the absence of reliable knowledge of paternity in early human history, the certainty of maternity made tracing lineage through the mother a very logical and practical basis for kinship. The examples you mentioned, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Minangkabau, and various African tribes, demonstrate that these weren't just abstract concepts but lived social realities, where women often held significant economic, social, and even political authority. Women in these societies sometimes controlled land and resources and had considerable say in community decisions.
Okay, so we have this intriguing glimpse of early societies. With more gender balance, more fluidity in roles, it begs the question, what flipped the script? What was the big turning point? The sources really emphasize the agricultural revolution as a pivotal moment.
Absolutely. The shift to settled agriculture.
Yeah.
Roughly between 10,000 and 3,000 BCE. And the emergence of the concept of private land ownership fundamentally altered the way societies organized themselves. Land became the most stable and valuable resource. And this created a whole new set of concerns, particularly around inheritance.
Right, land equals wealth. And suddenly, who gets to inherit that wealth becomes a really big deal. This seems to be a crucial driver in the shift towards patrilineal inheritance. That is, tracing family lineage through the father's side.
Precisely. Unlike the cuneiform land use prevalent in hunter-gatherer societies, settled agriculture allowed individuals and families to claim specific plots of land as their own. This desire to keep that valuable land within a particular family line then placed a much higher premium on knowing who the male descendants were.
And along with this new concept of land ownership came a changing division of labor. Men became increasingly involved in the more physically demanding aspects of farming and herding, activities that became increasingly linked to land ownership and perceived as the primary drivers of economic productivity. Meanwhile, women's roles tended to become more focused on domestic tasks and child rearing, perhaps partly due to more stable food supplies leading to higher birth rates.
What's crucial here is how this shift in labor, while perhaps appearing practical at the time, gradually led to a devaluation of women's contributions. Their vital role in earlier food production became less visible and less valued. In the new context of land ownership and large-scale agriculture, which was increasingly dominated by men.
And this newfound emphasis on ensuring biological paternity, that sounds like it had some pretty significant ripple effects on how women were viewed and treated. The sources talk about an increased emphasis on controlling women's sexuality and reproductive choices.
It is indeed. The concept of women as, in a sense, property starts to emerge more strongly during this period. The need to guarantee male lineage for the purposes of inheritance, of land and wealth, led to greater regulation of women's bodies and their reproductive capabilities. Marriage increasingly became less about partnership between equals and more about establishing clear lines of inheritance and cementing male control.
And sadly, this also meant a loss of women's economic power, exclusion from land ownership, increased economic dependence on men.
Precisely. As men became more strongly associated with land ownership and the primary forms of agricultural labor, their perceived economic contribution to the household and the community rose in prominence, while women's essential but often unpaid domestic work and contributions to smaller-scale agriculture were increasingly relegated to the private sphere and lost its societal recognition.
Okay, so agriculture seems to have laid the groundwork, but the sources also point to another major factor, that further entrenched patriarchy, the rise of organized warfare and militarization.
Yes, as early cities began to develop, roughly from 4000 BCE to 500 CE, competition for increasingly scarce resources intensified, leading to the development of more formalized armies. And this is where physical strength, which was often traditionally associated with men, became highly valued for military success.
Right, warrior elites and kingship emerged. Military leaders started becoming rulers, establishing male political dominance, and the concept of dynastic rule in places like Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and early China, women were largely excluded.
What's fascinating to consider is how this intertwining of military might and political authority further cemented male dominance. Leadership increasingly became synonymous with military strength and prowess, an arena from which women were largely excluded due to prevailing societal norms and differences in physical capabilities, although history does offer us some remarkable exceptions, like female warriors and rulers who defined these norms. Marriage alliances also increasingly became political tools, used to forge peace or strengthen alliances between male rulers, further highlighting women's lack of autonomy in these power dynamics.
And it wasn't just about who was wielding the swords. The sources also mentioned the development of legal codes during this period.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As patriarchal power structures became more entrenched through economic and military developments, legal systems emerged that explicitly enshrined male dominance and codified women's subordinate status into law. This formalized what might have previously been more fluid social customs into legally enforceable norms and regulations.
Which brings us to the really crucial role of law itself in institutionalizing patriarchy. Ancient legal codes were absolutely pivotal in establishing and enforcing male dominance.
Precisely. In many ancient societies, women were legally considered the property of their male guardians, first their fathers and then their husbands. This fundamental concept had far-reaching implications for nearly every aspect of their rights and freedoms.
Take Hammurabi's code in Mesopotamia, dating back to around 1754 BCE. It explicitly favored men in matters of divorce, imposed unequal punishments for adultery, with women facing far harsher consequences, and dictated rules of inheritance that heavily favored male heirs. In some instances, men even had the legal right to sell their wives into slavery under certain conditions, and the practice of women wearing veils as symbols of male control.
It is. The Code of Hammurabi provides a stark and early example of how legal frameworks were deliberately constructed and used to establish and maintain rigid gender hierarchies, the clear inequalities embedded in laws concerning marriage, divorce, adultery, and property rights, along with the symbolic control exerted through practices like veiling, all point to a legal system that actively and unequivocally entrenched male authority.
Then we had the laws of Manu in India, composed around 200 BCE, which stated quite unequivocally that a woman must never be independent, prescribing lifelong male guardianship, and even going so far as to decree that a husband should be viewed as divine by his wife.
It is. The laws of Manu paint a picture of complete and utter female dependence, reinforcing the ideology that women were inherently incapable of self-governance and required constant male oversight and control at every stage of their lives.
And we see similar patterns in ancient Hebrew law, as found in the Torah, with limited inheritance rights for women.
Again, across these diverse ancient legal systems, we see a recurring pattern of legal frameworks that systematically disadvantage women in fundamental areas like property rights, legal accountability, and personal autonomy,
Yeah.
further contributing to their subordinate social status.
And let's not forget Roman law, with the concept of paterfamilias, granting absolute authority to the eldest male in the household. Women were under the legal control of their fathers and then their husbands, barred from participating in civic life, unable to vote, hold public office, or even serve as legal witnesses in many cases.
Roman law, despite its remarkable sophistication and influence in other areas of jurisprudence, was undeniably patriarchal in its treatment of women. The paterfamilias system concentrated immense power in the hands of men, leaving women in a state of perpetual legal minority, with severely limited rights and agency. The restrictions on their participation in public life further cemented their exclusion from positions of power and influence within the state.
So across these different ancient civilizations, we see these legal codes consistently acting to restrict women's rights.
Exactly. These ancient legal codes provided a formal and often divinely sanctioned basis for patriarchy, effectively making it the legal and social norm, and systematically disadvantaging women in fundamental ways. They laid a legal groundwork that would unfortunately influence subsequent legal traditions.
Now, shifting gears slightly, another incredibly powerful force in shaping societal views and consequently gender roles is religion.
Absolutely. Religious narratives often provide the foundational myths, moral frameworks, and cosmological understandings that deeply influence cultural norms, social practices, and even legal systems. The stories we tell about our origins, the roles of divine beings, and the perceived nature of humanity can have a profound and lasting impact on how we view the world and our place within it, including the roles and status of men and women.
Take the story of Eve in the Abrahamic religions, blamed for the original sin, leading to that divine pronouncement in Genesis, "He shall rule over you."
It has indeed. The interpretation of the story of Eve has contributed to persistent views of women as inherently more susceptible to temptation, morally weaker, and therefore in need of male guidance and control to prevent societal and moral decay. This theological perspective has had profound and far-reaching consequences for how women have been perceived and treated across numerous cultures.
And then you have the myth of Pandora in Greek mythology,
Yeah.
who unleashes all the evils into the world.
Similarly, the myth of Pandora reinforces a negative archetype of women as the bringers of trouble and chaos, further contributing to a societal perception that they need to be controlled and their influence limited to protect the social order.
Hinduism, with the laws of Manu we discussed earlier, also reinforced deeply patriarchal norms.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Religious texts, traditions, and interpretations in many cultures have historically played a significant role in reinforcing male dominance and prescribing subordinate roles for women, often providing divine or moral justifications for these hierarchical arrangements.
Even in ancient Greek beliefs, despite their groundbreaking advancements in philosophy and democracy, there was a prevailing view that women were inherently not suited for political life.
Yes, even within the celebrated democracy of Athens, which is often held up as a cornerstone of Western political thought. Women were entirely excluded from citizenship and any form of political participation.
Yeah.
Based on the deeply ingrained patriarchal belief that their natural sphere was the domestic one.
And then we look at the medieval Catholic Church, a hugely influential institution in Western history. The sources clearly show how religious justifications for male authority were drawn from interpretations of the story of Eve and the teachings of figures like St. Paul, who emphasized women's silence and submission within the church and the household, the exclusion of women from all positions of religious and political leadership within the church.
The Catholic Church in the Middle Ages wielded immense spiritual and temporal power, and its doctrines played a very significant role in reinforcing prevailing patriarchal norms throughout Europe. The complete exclusion of women from leadership positions not only directly limited their power within that institution, but also reinforced the broader societal idea that authority, both spiritual and secular, was fundamentally a male prerogative. The Church's control over aspects of women's lives, including their bodies and sexuality, through doctrines of virginity and chastity and the horrific witch hunts that disproportionately targeted women.
Right, the witch hunts, a truly dark chapter in history, often targeting women who didn't conform to societal expectations or who held traditional knowledge like herbal healers.
Absolutely. By systematically limiting women's access to education and intellectual pursuits, the church further reinforced their dependence on men and their confinement to domestic roles, making it considerably more difficult for them to challenge prevailing patriarchal norms and assumptions.
So we've explored how agriculture, the rise of warfare, the development of legal systems, and the influence of religious beliefs all played significant roles in the rise and entrenchment of patriarchy.
Yes, in ancient Greece, even with the celebrated development of democracy in Athens, as we discussed earlier, it was a system that paradoxically reinforced gender inequality by explicitly excluding women from the rights and responsibilities of citizenship and any form of political participation. And even in Sparta, which granted women more physical freedoms and a more prominent role in managing household affairs. While men were away at war, they remained excluded from political decision-making and governance.
And then in the feudal era,
Precisely. The feudal system, with its rigid hierarchical structures based on land ownership and military service, largely excluded women from positions of power and influence. The church's continued reinforcement of patriarchal doctrines provided a powerful ideological justification and support for this social and political order.
now let's fast forward a few centuries to the Industrial Revolution. You might think with such huge societal and economic upheaval, things would start to shift dramatically in terms of gender roles.
The Industrial Revolution certainly brought about significant transformations, including the rise of the separate spheres ideology. This was a powerful social construct that assigned men primarily to the public sphere of work and politics, while women were relegated largely to the private sphere of home and family. All on the surface, this might have seemed like a simple division of labor.
Right, the public sphere for men, the private for women. This ideology, even though it didn't always reflect the realities of working-class women, who often had to work outside the home.
Exactly. The ideal of separate spheres was largely a middle and upper-class phenomenon, but even for working-class women, who toiled in factories and mines, their economic contributions were often seen as secondary or supplementary to men's breadwinning role, further entrenching economic inequalities and reinforcing patriarchal norms.
And legally, we continue to see persistent barriers. The English common law doctrine of coverture, which essentially meant that a married woman's legal identity.
These legal barriers were absolutely crucial in maintaining male dominance during the Industrial Revolution and beyond. By denying women economic independence through property restrictions and political agency through the denial of suffrage, the legal system actively continued to reinforce patriarchal power structures well into the modern era. It wasn't until the rise of powerful and sustained women's rights movements in the 19th and 20th centuries that these deeply entrenched legal systems began to be seriously challenged and dismantled in many parts of the world.
Which all leads us to a really important point that the sources highlight, the contingent nature of patriarchy.
Exactly. The very existence of those early egalitarian societies we discussed at the beginning clearly demonstrates that patriarchy was not the only way human societies could organize themselves. The shift towards patriarchy was driven by a complex interplay of specific historical developments: the rise of settled agriculture, organized warfare, the development of legal systems, and the pervasive influence of religious ideologies, not by some inherent or immutable biological imperative.
And the fact that we see ongoing challenges to patriarchal structures throughout history.
Precisely. The historical narrative of patriarchy is also importantly a history of resistance. Women, in various ways and across different cultures and time periods, have consistently sought greater rights, challenged the limitations imposed upon them, and worked towards a more equitable distribution of power, demonstrating that these power structures are not absolute and can be, and indeed have been, contested and transformed.
So as you can see, this ding dive into the origins of patriarchy reveals that the systems we see today, while deeply entrenched with long historical roots, were not always the norm.
What's a fascinating takeaway
Yeah.
is the sheer scale of the transformation. For what appears to be the vast majority of human history, our social structures looked quite different.
Isn't it fascinating to consider that for the vast majority of human history, our social structures looked quite different, with more balance in gender roles and influence?
It certainly does. It forces us to question those assumptions and to recognize that what we experience today is the product of a long and complex historical process.
Exactly. And understanding these historical origins is so important because it helps us recognize that gender roles are not fixed in stone. but are instead social and cultural constructs that have evolved over time and, crucially, can continue to evolve in the future.
What stands out to you most profoundly from this journey through history? What key questions does this exploration raise for you about the present day?
For me, it's the realization of just how many different factors had to align and reinforce each other over centuries to create the patriarchal systems we know today. It wasn't just one single cause. It was a cascading effect of economic shifts, the rise of conflict, and the power of ideas enshrined in law and religion. And it really makes me wonder what seemingly subtle shifts are happening in our modern world.
That's a wonderfully insightful question. And I think for me, it's the persistent and powerful role of ideology,
Yeah.
whether religious or secular, in justifying and maintaining these power imbalances. Recognizing those underlying narratives and critically examining them
Yeah.
is, I believe, absolutely crucial for any meaningful progress towards greater gender equality.
Absolutely. We encourage you, our listener, to delve even deeper into specific periods or the history of women's resistance against these systems.
And it's important to remember that this is a global story with countless regional and cultural variations. We've touched on some key examples from different parts of the world. But each culture has its own unique and fascinating trajectory
Yeah.
in the development and evolution of gender roles.
Considering the deeply contingent nature of patriarchy, what specific shifts in our modern world